You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of August 2026 on Monocle Radio.
Bosnian Serb war criminal Ratko Mladic dies at the age of 84. What was the director of the CIA doing in Moscow, and did he want everyone to know he was doing it, whatever it was? And dare we hope that Syria might enjoy a change of luck? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Ash Bhardwaj and Hannah Lucinda Smith will discuss the day's big stories, and we will conclusively settle the debate between hotels and Airbnbs. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. Hannah Lucinda Smith and Ash Bhardwaj will join us shortly. But first, the death has been reported today of Ratko Mladic, the former Bosnian Serb army general who was serving a life sentence in the Netherlands for crimes committed during the Bosnian War of the 1990s. Mladic was 84, having outlived by several decades most of his thousands of victims. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Monocle's Balkans correspondent, Guy Delaunay. Guy, I realise that there isn't one concise answer to this question. There's probably at least three long answers to this question. But how will news of Mladic's passing land in Bosnia-Herzegovina now?
Well, it depends where you are in Bosnia and Herzegovina. If you are in the Federation, which is to say the bit which is mostly inhabited by Bosniak Muslims and Croats, then people will certainly not be shedding any tears. On the other hand, if you are in Republika Srpska, you will be mourning the loss of somebody who you consider a hero of your race, which is completely bizarre, but that's just how it is. And to this day, I think one of the great tragedies of Bosnia and Herzegovina is that the politicians who are in charge, they pursue a model of divide, rule and profit. And I don't make any exceptions in this. But what we do see on the Bosnian Serb side, the way in which this manifests itself, is that anybody who's been brought to trial in The Hague for crimes committed during the war in Bosnia in the 1990s is generally cast as a hero. And that's what they do for Ratko Mladic. And just to give you one example of this, we've got Aleksandar Vulin, who I've referred to in the past as sort of the Flavor Flav of the Serbian government, and that he says outrageous things so that the sensible people in the government don't have to. But there's a reason why he's there. Now, he doesn't currently hold a ministerial post, but he's got very strong ties to Republika Srpska in Bosnia. He has previously been Serbia's interior minister, he's previously been the defense minister, and his comment was, from Gavrilo Princip to Ratko Mladic, the best Serbs are killed while tied up. He did not die among those he loved and did not cry at his daughter's grave, but he will not die among Serbs, and there will be those who will cry for him. That's the statement of a former Serbian government minister.
In Serbia itself, he does retain a cachet as well, doesn't he? I mean, I can recall on my most recent visit to Belgrade, which was a couple of years ago, still being quite surprised by how easy it would have been, were I so inclined to buy a T-shirt with his face on it.
Absolutely. You walk down Knez Mihajlova, which is the main pedestrian drag in Belgrade, and his face is there next to the faces of people like Vladimir Putin and also the former head of the Chetniks from the 1940s, a movement which was seen on one side as a liberation movement, but on the other side as a Nazi movement. And, you know, these problematic figures, they still sell today. And there's even a mural of Ratko Mladic in one street in Belgrade. Multiple efforts were made to remove this, but someone somewhere with some degree of power was allowing the people who painted the mural to push people away, keep on repainting it. Certainly, I think there's an element there that the powers that be see it as beneficial to have Ratko Mladic still as a figure that a certain type of people can rally around.
Just finally, Guy, is his appeal, such as it may be, something that has transcended generations in Serbia? Because it is curious to think that there would be people now heading for their 30th birthday across the former Yugoslavia born since that war ended.
Well, this is the thing. Who do you think the football hooligans are who are lionising Ratko Mladic these days? Football hooliganism is generally a young man's game. So the ultras from Red Star and Partizan who are doing these sort of things, who are holding up tifos in stadiums, lionising Mladic and broadcasting other nationalist slogans, they weren't around during the wars of the 1990s. So this has indeed been transmitted down in certain quarters. I wouldn't want anybody to think this is a majority view in Serbia by any means. It isn't. But there's a sizable enough minority that make a very loud noise.
Guy Delaunay, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Daily. You are back with The Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and we can bring in our panel now. Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent, and Ash Bhardwaj, journalist and travel expert, author of Why We Travel, The Independent's best travel book of 2024. Ash, that was 2 years ago. What have you done for us lately?
Not a huge amount. I'm about to move to Oxford, so I can let you know how that will be once I get there.
That's travelling of a sort?
Certainly travelling psychologically as well, trying to make a new home somewhere, trying to get to know a new city. It's very different when you just visit somewhere to that slow discovery you have when you're somewhere like Istanbul.
I mean, two very, very different cities now that I think about it. But Oxford is one of those places, though, that I think people will walk around fairly frequently, and I've done it myself and thought, wow, this seems really nice.
Yeah.
What's the downside when you actually decide I'm going to live here?
Oxford specifically?
Yeah, let's see if we can get you hounded out of town by an angry mob with pitchforks before you've even got your phone connected.
I mean, the commute to the Monocle office is going to be much harder or much longer. I'm really looking forward to being close to a nice river, because the Thames up there is much nicer than the Thames in London. Looking forward to being close to the countryside. I think, though, I might be able to complete all of the food and cultural experiences of Oxford within 2 months, which would be hard pushed to do one borough in London.
Indeed. Hannah, you have recently been doing one of those things that people come to London to do, in fact, which is go to the theatre.
Yes, absolutely. It's been a really long time, because I think we don't appreciate this about London, right? Like, I lived in Istanbul for a really long time, and Istanbul, of course, is a mega city. It's got at least, it depends who you ask, but I would say at least 20 million people in there. But actually, for arts and culture, it's so much more limited than London, and it's one thing I really miss. So this week with some friends, I went to see Abigail's Party, if you remember that. 1970s relic by Mike Leigh. Have they updated it for the world of half a century later? Slightly. I won't give anything away, but I mean, basically, it had this set, which was this wonderful 70s living room. Of course, Beverly's dress was a 70s monstrosity of polyester. You can't change that. I mean, that's...
Obviously not.
The dress is kind of its own character. But yeah, there were sort of little clever references to sort of the way that society's changed in Britain. But I think ultimately what makes it a great play is that all the kind of tensions that drive it are deeply human. They might be sort of framed in the 70s setting, but there is relevance today, I think.
Well, we start in Moscow, as recently briefly visited by CIA Director John Ratcliffe. There being means by which US intelligence officials may contact their Russian counterparts without the hassle and publicity of flying halfway across the world, it can be reasonably inferred that Ratcliffe had something important to impart and wished to be seen to be imparting it. Various US media have reported that the aim of Ratcliffe's mission was to brandish beneath Russian noses intelligence suggesting that Russia intended to give NATO a proper poke in order to test its resolve, probably in the Baltics. Ratcliffe stopped off in Latvia in both directions, and also to strongly suggest that Russia not push its luck. Ratcliffe's excursion was spotted, as the CIA surely knew it would be, by online flight tracker nerds. Let's hear first from Ian Pechenik, Director of Communications at Flight Radar 24, on the rise of flight tracker journalism.
The brilliance of flight tracking data is that it's real time. So if media is the first draft of history, you're getting the pre-write. And you can find things that are happening in the world as they are happening. And we've seen with major flights this week, for instance, the C-17 going into Moscow, but previous flights where Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi flew to Taiwan, in real time, that was followed. So you're getting history as it happens. Our users are extremely good at flagging things that are unusual or interesting, and a U.S. Air Force C-17 flying into Russian airspace at this point in time is certainly one of those things.
That was Ian Pechenik at Flight Radar 24. Hannah, I am reminded somewhat of the attempted coup in Turkey in 2016 when it was possible to watch in real time President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's plane flying round and round in circles as he presumably frantically made phone calls trying to figure out whether he still had a job.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Flight Radar is one of those sites that journalists just absolutely love, at least the geeky journalists do. And I think pretty much these days, at any of these kind of like really critical points in history, you can always turn to Flight Radar to give you the kind of real story of what's going on. I mean, I remember watching it sort of obsessively for about 2 days straight in the lead up to Bashar al-Assad fleeing Damascus in 2024, and you could see these private jets sort of pinballing between Damascus and the Gulf. Clearly, well, it came out later; it was confirmed, carrying some of the sort of cash and gold and artifacts and things like that out of Syria before Assad fled. But I think it's one of the sort of delights of modern journalism is that we do have tools like this where we can sort of see the story behind the story.
Ash, I would be astonished if Director Ratcliffe was surprised that people had noticed that he was flying to Moscow. So was the publicity important to this mission? Did Ratcliffe, as I have wildly speculated, very much want everybody to know he was going to Moscow?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's part of the signalling. And the spy agencies have always had a part of diplomacy and strategic communications and international relations, letting the partners, but also the population of the partners of the United States know that this is something that is happening. And I think that a lot of the European allies of the United States have been very worried over the last few years, and particularly since Trump's second term, about whether or not the United States would really be there for them if Russia were to do something. So the director of the CIA flying over to do this is a signal to those allies that we're still involved, we're still trying to deter Russia. The whole point of NATO is to stop Russia doing something in the first place, because it then get a big kick back. But you'd much rather they don't do something in the first place. I mean, the last time the CIA director did fly to Russia to have a chat with the same guy, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Agency of Russia, was just before 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. We don't know exactly why John Ratcliffe, the new CIA director, went to go and have this conversation. There's speculation about that. Could it have been about things happening with Iran? It seems to make more sense, particularly with the stop-off in Riga, that it was trying to deter an attack on the Baltics. But when Brennan went in 2022 to tell the Russians, we know what you're planning, the invasion of Ukraine, don't do it, it didn't have an effect. They went ahead anyway.
Oh, well, indeed. Are we, though, greatly reassured, Hannah, by the fact that Latvia's president, Edgars Rinkevičs, who presumably has either spoken to Ratcliffe on one of these stops or spoken to people who spoke to Ratcliffe, has said the risk of direct Russian invasion remains low? I mean, there are, to be fair, no reports of widespread panic in Latvia or elsewhere in the Baltics.
I think it is reassuring, especially coming after this summer where it's really felt often like the momentum's building up, right? We've had what could be accidental sort of drones hitting buildings in Romania. We had a drone, explosive loaded drone intercepted in Germany. We've had most recently Andy Burnham handing over blueprints for weaponry to Ukraine and provoking quite a harsh response from Russia saying we will retaliate. I think that is, a sort of bit of a moment where you can sort of relax a little bit. Maybe not too much. I think the signals which are coming are that NATO is concerned and is preparing for a possible Russian attack within the next couple of years.
Is there, though, nevertheless, Ash, a reasonable concern of what you might think of as a war by miscalculation? I mean, everybody knows what the nightmare scenario is, which is, a small number of men wearing khaki and carrying rifles but with no identifying shoulder flashes turn up in, for example, Narva, just inside Estonia across the river from Russia, announce they've instituted some sort of provisional government. Everybody knows what's going on here, but Russia is basically staring at the West and saying, we're going to do World War III over this. The trouble being, of course, that if NATO doesn't do World War III over that, then NATO is no longer functional. And the other side of it is NATO might go, well, yes, we are, in which case Putin is the one who has miscalculated, but this does nobody any good.
I mean, none of it does anybody any good, and certainly the invasion of Ukraine hasn't helped anybody, not least the Ukrainians. And this risk of miscalculation with NATO, NATO may have chosen to have had a heavier response for those drones in Romania or the discovery of the drones in Germany. Interestingly, the Germans haven't chosen to yet name Russia as being behind those drones, although I'm sure the intelligence services have a very strong indication of who it is.
The trouble is, if you name somebody, you then kind of feel obliged to do something.
Correct. Yeah. So not only is it hard to attribute, but then you actually have to do something about it. So there's a couple of risks there. The other thing is, there may be something that Russia could do that we haven't seen yet. We sort of assume they're going to repeat what they did in Crimea if they were to do something in Narva, for example. But there could be a methodology that is beyond what anyone has already imagined, that they might deliver. Their point, their objective here is not to get into a fight with the Europeans or with NATO generally. It's to stop the Europeans in particular from providing support to Ukraine so that they can increase the rate of their conquest of Donbass. That has had an effect on the Germans, who haven't supplied the Taurus missile system. What this might do is might change the calculation in somewhere like Germany, where Germany may choose to give them the Taurus missile system now, or other things of that ilk. So the risk of miscalculation is there, but I think everybody wants to avoid the fight if they can.
I mean, I suppose just as a final thought on this, Hannah, can we at least be reassured by the fact that this flight and this apparent warning has actually occurred at all, presumably with the consent of the President of the United States? Because the other worry that has hung over everybody, aside from just, for example, the Narva scenario this last year and a bit, is that Vladimir Putin might be thinking, well, the ultimate decision maker on any response would be the President of the United States. And for the next little while at least, I have a President of the United States who, shall we say, has an unusually charitable view of Russia.
Yeah, I think there's two ways that we can look at this. One is a sort of more positive way, which is, of course, there has been so much angst within NATO, and particularly in Europe, about just how committed Donald Trump is to the alliance. And looking at it from that perspective, this is a good sign, right? Or we could look at it from what Ash mentioned previously, which is the last time a CIA director went over to Moscow, it was just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So if we're going to look at it in a slightly more cynical way, is this a sign that something quite big and quite unwanted is brewing?
Well, let's move along somewhat. As anybody who has already absorbed this week's Foreign Desk Explainer will be aware, it has been a pretty big week for Syria. Finally removed from the United States list of state sponsors of terrorism after 47 years, and somewhat ironically on the watch of a Syrian president who was himself, until really quite recently, officially regarded by the US as a specially designated global terrorist. In theory, at least, this will liberate investors keen to facilitate Syria's reconstruction and allows Syria to better access global financial networks. Just this week, President Ahmed al-Sharaa made Syria's first electronic Visa card payment for a coffee in the old city of Damascus. First of all, some gentle suggestions from Monocle's Lily Austin and Fernando Augusto Pacheco about further possible uses to which President al-Sharaa may put his new credit card.
Hello, I'm Lily Austin, producer of Monocle and Fashion and The Foreign Desk.
And hello, I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco, senior correspondent at Monocle and presenter of The Stack. And this is our shopping spree guide for President Ahmed al-Sharaa.
President al-Sharaa, there's been a lot of attention paid to you switching from military fatigues to sharp suits, and I'm loving it. But it's time to expand the wardrobe a little bit. Now, dressing locally has become very important on diplomatic missions. We've seen Andy Burnham has been donning T-shirts by a Manchester designer. So for you, I suggest Salim Azam. He's a Lebanese designer, reviving artisanal techniques. It'll be perfect for bringing your wardrobe from sharp suits to more day-to-night off-duty looks.
I think they're very good suggestions, but of course, if you're also looking for something sharp that also lets you breathe in the Syrian heat, I would suggest wearing a Charvet shirt, of course, and a blazer from an up-and-coming brand called Missy. And naturally, my favorite, if you are allowed, a pair of fitted shorts by JBB from Bangkok.
Ooh, yes, please. Okay, so on to scents. We know that Donald Trump has been taking a vested interest in how you're smelling. When you were visiting the White House recently, he sprayed you with a Victory 47 cologne. Lucky you. But Faye, if he wants to expand his scent remit, what would you suggest?
Well, as you know, first impressions begin with smell, not sight. And given that you're constantly traveling and meeting new people, my recommendations are Night Clubbing by Celine offers something a bit more suave, Eau de Papier by Diptyque.
And what shopping spree is complete without a trip to the bookshop? So, while you're there, I recommend that you pick up Confect, A Guide to Generous Hosting, written by Confect's editor Sophie Grove. It's full of fabulous tips, including not to write down your place settings, but to commit them to memory. It's much more chic that way. With that, you'll be sorted for all of the guests that are going to be coming through Syria's doors. And after all that, you're going to be in desperate need of some refreshment. And we know that you love a coffee. So I've got to direct you towards the Monocle Cafe. I can recommend the oat flat white. Delicious.
Very good idea. I have another suggestion for Al Shara. How about an ice-cold lemongrass tea? Although after suits, perfume, sports gear and books, perhaps he should check the presidential credit limit first.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco and Lily Austin. Hannah, even after he's applied all that advice, excellent though it was, how optimistic do you think President al-Shara can afford to be? You've seen kind of a lot up close of Syria's emergence from war. Yeah.
I mean, look, if you look at the Middle East as a whole, Syria's doing pretty well, right? And particularly considering that it had this generation-long grinding civil war that it only came out of in 2024. Before that, 5 decades of family dictatorship. And, on paper, not too much of a promising new leader. As you mentioned before, Ahmed al-Shara, former leader of al-Qaeda's franchise in Syria, one of the most wanted men in the world, considered a terrorist. And yet he's leading Syria, a country which, has been destroyed to a degree that's quite difficult to describe, economically, socially, physically. He seems to be leading it slowly into a kind of better future. The lifting of sanctions is a really, really important thing because when I went, for example, 2 months after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, it wasn't possible to use any kind of bank card anyway. You had to do everything in cash. You had to take in dollars. Then you'd exchange it for this stack of Syrian pounds. You're literally carrying it around in plastic bags because it'd been devalued so much. Everybody's relying on that. Obviously because of that, no companies want to come in, international companies, and invest there. These are all things that companies need in order to have confidence in Syria, to know that they're not going to be punished for working there, to know that they're going to be able to, do their money transfers in a normal way. These are all the things that are really needed to reconstruct the country.
I mean, by the best guesses of the World Bank, Ash, there is somewhere north of $200 billion worth of business to be done just in terms of the physical rebuilding of Syria. I mean, it just seems good and sensible, doesn't it, that overseas companies should be able to do this.
Absolutely. And I think that's why creating a more stable security situation in Syria is important, not just for the Syrians, but for the businesses that might want to invest there. And they have a challenge at the moment, which is they've got these two neighbours, north and south, that both want to have a stake in Syria's sovereignty.
This being Turkey and Israel.
Yeah, and Israel in the south has taken the area around the Golan Heights to create this buffer zone, to create additional security. But it's also been striking airfields inside Syria where they believe that maybe Turkish troops are being based and so on. For Turkey, they seem to really want to ensure that they have security around their northern border, particularly the area that is Kurdish. The population is Kurdish of northern Syria. And they just want to have a stake in and a partnership with the future nation of Syria as it goes forward. So that must be really difficult for Syria. It's a nation that wanted to develop its sovereignty. It's almost been a playground for imperial ambitions over the last 15 years anyway, as you've had Russia, the United States, fighting in this territory for their own strategic goals. Other other nations in the Middle East as well, the Qatar, the Gulf states, all been involved in Syria. So I think they have this challenge in that they need to create security. Israel and Turkey are going to be the two countries on their borders that are going to have the biggest impact. How do they maintain sovereignty whilst also maintaining good relationships with both?
Hannah, we were talking in our previous item about Russia's action hopefully being constrained by the fact of the Baltic states' membership of NATO. However testy it gets between Israel and Turkey, is this a factor in Israel's thinking, or should it be? Because Turkey is a member of NATO, and it would be awkward at a number of levels if Israel took too big a swing at Turkey and Turkey went all Article 5 at them.
It would be incredibly awkward, wouldn't it? And particularly because, Turkey's really moved back into the sort of centre of the NATO fold since 2022, but particularly, in the past couple of years. Of course, we saw the NATO summit in Ankara in July, and President Erdogan being sort of widely praised by all the other leaders. 10 years ago, that absolutely wasn't the case when Turkey was, purchasing Russian missile defence equipment. So I think, certainly that is a card that Turkey would play. I don't think it's going to get to that. Behind the scenes, there are various back channels going on. Particularly, the most interesting, I think, is the back channel that's being set up between Syria and Israel. And I think it's fairly safe to assume that that's also a back channel for Ankara as well. The other thing, of course, to look at is what's going on with the Kurds. We've seen sort of very slow progress towards the Kurdish forces and the Kurdish political structures in the northeast of Syria being absorbed into the government and military in Damascus. It is a slow process. There's a lot of mistrust on both sides. There were basically adversaries during that conflict. But again, that would be something that would really kind of help, I think, Turkey, Israel to normalise what's going on in Syria. It would decrease the need, as Turkey sees it, for it to have boots on the ground in the north of the country.
Just before we leave this item, I want to return to Damascus because, again, we're trying to be optimistic. And the 63rd edition of the Damascus International Fair is, in fact, underway right now. We have this report from Abdullah Okaili, who's a Damascus-based journalist for various publications, including Al Jazeera, Wired and France 24.
I'm right now in the Damascus Fairground where the 63rd Damascus International Fair is taking place, an event that is very fundamental in the zeitgeist of the Syrian and regional psyche. This year, this edition is under the slogan Syria Rises Again, a sentiment that's been echoed in the Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharr's word of a new chapter of regeneration for Syria, for the country. This you can see actually as you arrive to the fairgrounds, as you start to arrive even, with the sheer number of flags that are being raised of countries participating into this fair, which is very symbolic of breaking the isolation that Syria has been undergoing for the past 14 years and its lack of integration into the international arena, even in the decades that preceded that. Here in the fair itself, you can see a very significant presence of internal and international companies and organizations, each having their own kiosk with their own products, displays or services, and each trying to leave a fingerprint and enter the emerging Syrian market, a market that's been isolated and now is up for the taking after the fall of the Assad regime and the removal of the sanctions that accompanied the regime's presence. However, something that is very interesting that you can see here in the behavior of Syrians in the fair itself is that Syrians are mostly treating the fair itself, ordinary Syrians, everyday Syrians, are treating it like a family day out, especially as several municipalities and city councils have provided free busing to the fairgrounds. So families have been coming here and mostly lingering within the food sector, maybe just window shopping within the technology sector without seeing actual purchases taking place. That perhaps speaks to the contrast between the flashy nature of these events and the reality of the Syrian population, a population in which 85% of is under the poverty line. Something that the new government, a challenge that the new government still has to take on and has to overcome, actually, to reach the stability the country needs. However, when you go through this fair, when you see the number of business councils, Syrian American, Syrian British, Syrian French, Syrian Turkish, and so on and so forth, you can see that this is perhaps one of the more solid steps that are taken for economic prosperity the country so desperately needs.
That was Abdullah O'Kiley at the Damascus International Fair. Hannah, just finally and quickly on this, because you were in Damascus as recently as 2025, did you get a sense of, I guess, optimism? Because people are going to need it. The task ahead of them is rebuilding an entire country from the ground up.
Yeah, I think it was a mix of, utter exhaustion with the conflict and also optimism. I mean, what was interesting in Damascus was that there was a real sort of buzz of ideas and everybody wanted to talk and everybody wanted to make jokes because they were never able to. Mm-hmm. And I came away, I contacted a friend of mine who's a Syrian-British writer, and I said, we should set up a salon right now in Damascus because this is the time to do it. It's time when everybody wants to sort of put their ideas into how the future is going to be built. But it's so interesting hearing this from the Damascus fair because I went to the fairgrounds while I was there. They'd been abandoned and they'd been looted, but what the looters didn't take was all the old posters from the fairs going right back to the 1950s. This was one of the biggest events of its kind in the Middle East. You used to have, the iconic Lebanese singer Fairouz would often open the show and, it was a really big event. So I think, the sort of revival of these kind of events in the Damascus calendar really are going to give a sense of hope and momentum.
Well, we shall conclude with travel generally and to the modern dilemma of whether to stay in a hotel with all the amenities and accountability that comes therewith, or in an Airbnb, i.e. the house of a stranger who may or may not answer late-night inquiries about where the goddamn key lockbox is, or uphold elementary levels of bathroom hygiene, have ever washed the bedding, or have been entirely clear on the listing about the rowdy family of raccoons in the roof. Alert listeners may have detected a bias in a certain direction on the part of this broadcaster. First of all, here is Hungarian interior designer Linda Boronke, followed by Tyler Brûlé, Monocle's editorial director and chairman, on what it takes to make a hotel people actually want to stay in 2026.
Hospitality is an interesting concept. I think it keeps changing. It derives from, luxury hospitality. 100 years ago, they didn't even have private bathrooms. And a few decades ago, there were not even amenities. Things are evolving so quickly. There's still this idea, the home away from home experience in hotels, but it's so outdated nowadays. People have amazing homes. People who can afford nice hotels, they probably have nicer homes than most hotels. I think hotels need to have a role in shaping people's aesthetic, idea on design, idea on service, idea of culinary experience. That aspect of the service itself and it being personalized and the hotel itself providing you an unforgettable experience, it goes way beyond the home away from home idea or the design itself. It comes down massively on operations and locality and giving something that you can only get in one specific location.
Fully agree. I like the notion that she picked up on the idea of operations because, again, you can commission the best architect, you can have the best designers, you can bring in the best lighting firm, hopefully, to work on your property. But if you don't have a solid head of rooms, if you don't have a solid head of housekeeping, if you don't have someone, of course, who is very strong in terms of just a sense of arrival, all of that completely falls apart. And I think oftentimes hotels say, well, who's our community manager and who's managing our social media? Yes, of course, important things. But if the fundamentals are not right, and then I think this is where you can often forgive hotels which are maybe a little bit dusty, hotels that maybe have a few nicks and dents in them, then that's absolutely fine because if the operations are solid, if the linen is crisp, if the water pressure is good, all of these basics that we want from a good property, it comes down to that. So I think just, the point Ms. Borke is making is spot on, and we can never forget operations.
That was the Hungarian interior designer Linda Boronke, followed by Tyler Brûlé, Monocle's editorial director and chairman. And there is yet more on this dilemma by Nick Manise in an opinion on monocle.com, which you can go and read just as soon as you've finished listening to this. Ash, I'm actually a useful test case on this because I was in Stavanger last week doing a Monocle thing. I spent 2 nights in a sort of 3.5/4-star hotel, 2 nights in an Airbnb. I remain absolutely baffled as to why anybody would not prefer the hotel. Where are you on this?
The times when I content to use an Airbnb is if I'm travelling on multi-generational travel. If I'm going with my kids, maybe with catching up with my sister or some friends with their kids, then an Airbnb is good because you have lots of communal space.
Okay, I can see that.
If you're staying
I can grudgingly concede that much.
If you're staying in a hotel room, you don't have that, or it's just chaos when you're all in one room.
But obviously, when you're travelling with my colleagues, communal space is a positive disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean, it does also encourage you to go down to the bar where you can have more fluid conversation. But the thing that I really like about hotels when they're done really well is they really give you a sense of place. Now, of course, if you're staying in a really good Airbnb that is someone's home, that can also happen. But so often Airbnbs tend to be that sort of grey and beige and that awful
There's an Airbnb aesthetic now, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's like has no personality. I was in Ghent, this place called 1898 The Post. It's the old post office building in Ghent, and they've just opened this bit called the Porterhouse, and they've just done it all up. What I loved about it was I felt immersed in the narrative, in the history, in the story, and the identity of the place because they'd put so much thought into it. There were all these little trinkets and images and bits of architecture and plans on the wall that drew me into the place, which is the total opposite of that grey aesthetic that you get of an Airbnb. So when done well, not only is it, as Tyler was saying, the water pressure and the linen, but it's that sense of place, because that's where you go to other places. You go somewhere else because the sense of it is different to where you come from. And a good hotel does that well.
Hannah, where are you on this? Because one of the advantages, though it's sometimes a disadvantage, of being a frequently travelling foreign correspondent, as both you and I have been, is that you stay in a wide variety, I think it's fair to say, of accommodation. I have stayed in some fabulous places, and I have stayed in places that I suspect it's probably not legal to keep livestock in. But do you have a preference between hotels and Airbnbs?
Definitely hotels. I think I agree with Ash. The only time for me when I would prefer an Airbnb is if I'm travelling on a break with a friend and we want a communal area to make dinner together and that kind of stuff. But I mean, definitely for all other purposes, a hotel, without question. And I really like hotels that I remember. What I can't stand is the very sort of bland, everything's nice, everything's perfect. I like going to the post-Soviet space and staying in what is marketed as the best hotel in town, because you can usually sort of imagine that somebody's gathering compromat on you, that kind of vibe. I remember staying in a brilliant one in Simferopol in Crimea, which we were talking about earlier. It's called the Hotel Ukraine, ironically enough.
I bet it's not anymore.
Right. Right. And it's just this, the internet didn't work and the breakfast, the staff were incredibly surly. And it was all sort of, Rococo style, slightly dusty, as you say, and I just loved every minute of it. It was fantastic.
Is there possibly an argument, though, Ash? This is something I have wondered about, though, whether a beneficial effect of Airbnb is that it has pulled down a lot of hotel prices. Because I organised some of that recent stay in Stavanger on my own account, and I have to say, given that Norway is no bargain at all, like this is the home of the £18 pint. The actually perfectly pleasant 3.5, 4-star hotel cost £100 a night.
Yeah, Stavanger's pretty good, partly because of the oil industry, and therefore they have quite a high supply of hotels there. But I think also Norway just feels less expensive now because London has become so expensive. So I think there's
still not £18 for a pint in London yet.
The thing that Airbnb originated in was basically giving up your free room or an airbed and breakfast is where it came from, for somebody visiting town. So you got to stay in someone's home, got to know them, and they might show you around, rather than what you have now, which is where people buy properties, give them this incredibly dull Airbnb aesthetic, and then rent them out as a hotel, rent them out as an Airbnb. If you can find those Airbnbs where it is literally someone's annex in their house or a room in their house, you can have quite a pleasant benefit of that, which is not everyone wants to do this when they're travelling, of course, which is meet somebody who isn't just someone that you're meeting in that sort of hotel, concierge, taxi, bar person relationship. So it can be quite nice if you can find that. But in the places where people are just buying places to turn them into Airbnbs, the flip side is it's making property very expensive if you want to rent. And that's been the problem in places like Barcelona, Paris, New York.
And indeed London. Ash Bhardwaj and Hannah Lucinda Smith, thank you both for joining us. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks also to Guy Delaunay at the top of the show, which was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Kaylee Martin. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu, with editing assistance from Lily Austin, Mariella Bevan and Christy O'Grady. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.